The winter had been longer than ever before, stretching its icy grip far beyond its usual rain. The deep snow that once glistened like a silver blanket over the forest had turned into a treacherous, unyielding crust, hiding what little food remained beneath it. The rivers, still frozen solid, held their fish hostage beneath thick sheets of ice. The berries that should have dried on the branches had long since been stripped away by the harsh winds or desperate scavengers. Even the great trees, which normally held reserves of sustenance in their bark and roots, seemed lifeless and barren. Luna, a mother bear, had endured harsh winters before, but never one like this. This time, she had 2 cubs, Theo and Milo, who relied entirely on her strength. Her instincts, her ability to guide them through the unforgiving wilderness. Yet as the days passed, and the hunger deepened in their small bellies, she felt the weight of an impossible decision pressing down on her. Theo and Milo were growing weaker. Their tiny bodies, once round with the softness of cubhood, now felt too light when she nudged them. Their playful energy had faded, replaced by exhaustion. Their whimpers of hunger were becoming less frequent, which, she knew, was even more alarming. Hunger was not only a battle of the body but also of the spirit. And her cubs were losing both. Luna had searched tirelessly. She had led them through the deepest parts of the forest, overturning logs in search of grubs, sniffing beneath the snow for buried roots. But it was never enough. Every promising scent turned out to be another disappointment. Other animals, foxes, lynxes, even the mighty elk, were facing the same starvation. Driven to desperate measures, the balance of nature had been disrupted, and Luna could feel the unspoken truth settling into her bones. The forest could no longer provide. Her instincts told her to stay. She was a bear. The forest was her home, the place where generations of her kind had thrived and struggled. To leave it was to step into the unknown, to expose herself and her cubs to dangers she could not predict. And yet, as she gazed at her cubs, their tiny bodies curled against her for warmth, she felt the weight of a mother's love pressing against the walls of her instincts. Desperation overrode caution. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, Luna nudged her cubs awake and started moving. Her powerful limbs, though weakened by hunger, carried her forward with a determination that even she did not fully understand. She did not stop at the familiar boundaries of the forest. She did not hesitate when the trees thinned, when the sounds of the wilderness began to shift into something unfamiliar. She was leaving. The scent of humans was foreign, sharp, unnatural. Luna had always kept her distance, had taught herself to avoid the places where the scent of smoke and metal lingered. But now, it was her only hope. She had heard distant stories carried by the wind, scents of food too strong to be ignored, places where humans left behind mountains of waste that other creatures had learned to scavenge. It was a dangerous gamble, but what choice did she have? Theo and Milo followed, their small legs struggling to keep up, their noses twitching at the strange new smells. They had never known a world beyond the trees, beyond the comfort of their mother's embrace. They trusted her, even as they stumbled into the unknown. The journey was arduous. Luna's body ached with every step, but she did not stop. When Theo stumbled, she gently lifted him with her muzzle, nudging him forward. When Milo hesitated, she gave him a soft growl of encouragement. They had to keep moving. By nightfall, they reached the edge of the forest. Before them lay a world unlike anything they had ever known. Lights, not the soft glow of the moon or the flickering of fireflies, but artificial, unnatural lights that gleamed against the dark sky. The ground beneath her paws shifted from dirt to something strange and hard. The air was thick with scents that made her head spin: food, metal, fuel, strange chemicals she could not name. Theo whimpered, pressing against her leg. Milo sniffed the air cautiously, his ears twitching at the distant sounds of human voices. Luna hesitated. This was not her world. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to turn back, to retreat into the safety of the trees. But then she saw it, something glistening in the dim light. A metal container, its lid slightly ajar, and from within, the unmistakable scent of food. Her heart pounded. With one last glance at her cubs, she stepped forward. She had never scavenged before, had never needed to, but necessity made her bold. Using her powerful claws, she pried open the lid. The smell was overwhelming. Scraps of meat, stale bread, remnants of human meals that would have once disgusted her. But now, they were salvation. She pulled out the food, pushing it toward Theo and Milo. The cubs, hesitant at first, sniffed at the strange offerings before hunger overtook their caution. They ate. Luna stood guard, her ears twitching at every sound, every distant movement. This was dangerous. She knew that humans did not welcome creatures like her into their world. She had heard the distant echoes of metal thunder, the weapons they carried. She had smelled the fear and anger that accompanied their presence. But she would not leave. Not until her cubs were strong again. For days, she remained at the edges of the human world, retreating into the shadows when necessary, waiting for the safety of night to scavenge. Each time she ventured out, she learned more. She found places where food was plentiful, places where humans left their waste unguarded. She learned the rhythms of their movements, the times when it was safe to emerge. She also learned the dangers. One night, as she searched for food, a bright light flashed in the distance, followed by the sound of voices, sharp, urgent. She froze, instinct roaring to life. Humans. They had seen her. She turned, racing back toward her cubs. She had stayed too long. The humans would come, and she could not let them find Theo and Milo. Luna led him away, deeper into the darkness, back toward the trees. She did not stop until the lights had faded behind them, until the scent of humans was once again a distant memory. She had taken a risk, and it had given them what they needed: strength, energy, a chance to survive. As the cruel spring continued, Luna knew she would have to make difficult choices again. But for now, she had done what was necessary. She had broken the unspoken laws of the wild, stepped beyond the boundaries of her world, all for the sake of her cubs. And she would do it again. For a mother's love knows no limits. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind whispered through the trees. Luna moved cautiously, her massive paws pressing into the soft earth, barely making a sound. The weight of hunger sat heavily in her bones. But she pressed on, nudging Theo along while carrying Milo gently in her mouth. The cubs were exhausted, their tiny bodies barely able to keep up. But there was no choice now. They had come too far to turn back. The forest behind them had offered nothing but starvation. Each day had been a cruel test of endurance. Each night a battle against the gnawing emptiness inside. She had tried everything: digging for roots, overturning logs, sniffing for anything that might sustain them. But winter had stolen it all, leaving only ice and barren ground. The cruel spring had not yet returned the abundance they needed. Now, they were here, in a world foreign and terrifying. The towering trees had been replaced by strange structures that loomed in the darkness. Rigid and lifeless, the scent of the wild had been overtaken by the overwhelming presence of humans, an unnatural mix of smoke, metal, and something else: food. The smell was unmistakable. It cut through the fear, awakening something primal within her. There was sustenance here, something she could not find in the forest. And for the first time in her life, Luna was willing to risk everything to reach it. She moved carefully through the shadows, her ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. The strange humming of metal beasts that humans rode. the flickering of artificial lights that lined their paths, the distant murmur of voices carried by the wind. Theo pressed himself close to her leg, his tiny body trembling. Milo, still in her mouth, was quieter, too weak to react. Then she smelled it. Closer. Stronger. Food. Not just any food, but something fresh, something real. It drifted from beyond a wooden fence, mingled with the scent of earth, trees, and something else, seeds, grains, perhaps even fruit. It was not just food, it was a garden, a place of life in this strange, lifeless world. Luna hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, pushing past the low fence and into the yard. It was a peaceful space, quiet in a way that the rest of the human world was not. The grass beneath her paws felt familiar, though softer than the forest floor. A large tree stood in the center, its branches swaying gently in the night breeze. But what drew her attention most was the small wooden platform near the house, where food had been left out, small bits of grain, seeds, and what smelled like scraps of bread. Food for birds. Her stomach clenched. It was not much, but it was something. She lowered Milo gently to the ground and nudged Theo toward the pile, encouraging them to eat. The cubs hesitated, their tiny noses wrinkling at the unfamiliar scent. But hunger won over caution. They began to nibble, their small mouths working quickly to consume what little they could. Luna stood guard, her muscles tense, her ears perked for any sign of danger. This place was not theirs. It belonged to the humans. And she knew from the stories carried by the wind that humans were unpredictable. Some feared bears, some hunted them, but others were different. The door to the house creaked open. Luna froze. A figure stepped out onto the porch, bathed in the golden glow of the house's light. The scent of the human was strong now, warm, familiar in a way that startled Luna. This human smelled of earth, of trees, of something gentle. Elena Carter had lived in this house for decades, tending to her garden, feeding the birds, and watching the seasons change. She had seen animals come and go, a fox darting through the brush, a family of raccoons scavenging near her compost, the occasional deer that wandered too close. But never this, never a bear, and certainly never a mother bear with two starving cubs. For a moment, neither moved. Luna watched Elena, her body tensed to flee, to protect her young. But Elena did not scream. She did not rush inside for a weapon or a phone. Instead, she simply stood there, her weathered hands gripping the edge of the doorframe, her eyes wide not with fear, but with something else, understanding. She could see it, the sharpness of Luna's ribs beneath her thick fur, the exhaustion in the way she stood, the way her cubs ate as if they had not seen food in days. They were starving. Slowly, carefully, Elena stepped back inside. Luna remained frozen, uncertain. Humans were unpredictable. What did this mean? Then, the scent came again, stronger now. The door opened once more, and Elena reappeared. But this time, she was carrying something in her hands. Food. She moved deliberately, setting it down on the edge of the porch. A plate with scraps of cooked chicken, bits of bread, and something that smelled like fruit. Not much, but enough. She stepped back. Luna hesitated. Was this a trick? Was it a trap? But the hunger was too deep, too desperate to ignore. She stepped forward cautiously, sniffing at the offering. It was strange, but it was food. She took a bite. The taste was unfamiliar, but it filled the hollow space in her stomach. Theo and Milo, sensing it was safe, moved closer, their tiny mouths eagerly nibbling at the scraps. Elena watched, her heart aching. She had always believed in kindness, in the quiet responsibility humans had to the world around them. And now, in this moment, she knew. This was why she had stayed here all these years. Why she had tended her garden. Why she had never stopped leaving food for the animals that passed through. Because sometimes, even the wild needed a little kindness. Luna watched her with cautious eyes. But there was something else now. Something softer. Something almost grateful. And for the first time in weeks, as her cubs ate beside her, Luna felt something she had nearly forgotten. Hope. They would survive. And perhaps, just perhaps, this meeting on a quiet spring night would change everything. For them all. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the lingering chill of the previous night. Elena Carter rose early, as she always did, shuffling toward the kitchen with the comforting ritual of coffee in mind. But as she reached for the curtains to welcome the morning light, her hand froze. Outside, beneath the large oak tree in her backyard, was a sight that stole the breath from her lungs. A mother bear lay curled around her two cubs, her body painfully thin, her fur clinging to the sharp ridges of her ribs. The cubs, no bigger than small dogs, were nestled against her, their tiny bodies barely moving. They looked exhausted, fragile, as if even breathing had become a struggle. Elena's heart clenched. Luna did not move when Elena stepped onto the porch. She lifted her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting Elena's. There was no aggression in them. No wild fury. No warning growl, only exhaustion. And something else. A plea. Elena had seen many things in her 72 years. Loss. Struggle. Hardship, but nothing quite like this. She knew the hunger of a starving creature. Had seen stray animals wander into town with the same sunken eyes. The same defeated posture. But this was different. This was a mother with her children, clinging to survival with everything she had left. And she had almost nothing left. Elena felt tears sting her eyes. She had always believed that kindness mattered, that it was the small acts of good that made the world bearable. Looking at Luna now, she knew there was no choice. She could not turn away. Could not pretend this was just another moment in the cycle of nature. These bears needed help. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, dialing the one person she knew would understand. Sophie, she said the moment the call connected, her voice thick with emotion. You need to come, now. Sophie Adams had been Elena's best friend for nearly 30 years. A retired wildlife rescuer, Sophie had spent her life tending to the wounded, the lost, the creatures caught between the wild and the world of humans. If anyone knew what to do, it was her. Elena barely had time to explain before Sophie's voice cut in. Steady and certain. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Call Daniel. Dr. Daniel Lee had been the town's veterinarian for decades. Though he mainly worked with domestic animals, he had a deep respect for wildlife, often volunteering to help rehabilitate injured creatures found near the forest's edge. Elena called him next, and after a brief silence, his answer came without hesitation. I'm on my way. Relief flooded her, but she knew time was still working against them. She needed to do something, anything, before help arrived. Her mind raced. Bears were omnivores, but they were in a weakened state. Their bodies needed something easy to digest, something with enough energy to give them strength. Then she thought of her pantry. She hurried inside, her hands moving on instinct, gathering what little she had that might help. A jar of honey, thick and golden, a container of oats, some apples and bananas. It wasn't much, but it was something. Outside, Luna remained where she was, her breathing slow, deliberate. The cubs barely stirred. Elena stepped forward cautiously, setting the food down on the ground, then retreating to the porch. She held her breath. For a long moment, Luna did not move. Then, slowly, she lifted her head, sniffing the air. She looked at Elena again, uncertain, wary, but hunger won over caution. She nudged one of the apples with her nose, licking at the surface before biting into it. The crunch was startling in the quiet morning air. Encouraged, She moved to the honey, dipping her tongue into the sweet nectar. The cubs, sensing their mother's shift, lifted their heads weakly. Luna made a soft noise, a gentle urging, and Theo crawled forward first, sniffing at the oats before nibbling tentatively. Milo followed, his tiny mouth pressing into a piece of banana. Elena felt the lump in her throat grow. They were eating. The knowledge that she had done something, however small, settled in her chest like warmth against the cold morning. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. Minutes stretched into an eternity until she heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel. Sophie was the first to arrive, stepping out of her car with practiced ease, her grey braid tucked beneath a thick wool scarf. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene before her face softened. "Oh, Elena," she murmured, stepping forward. Elena could only nod, emotions too heavy for words. Sophie approached slowly, her movements measured. She had worked with bears before, understood their body language, their fears. She crouched low, watching Luna, who watched her in return. "She's exhausted," Sophie murmured, "but she's still fighting." Dr. Lee arrived moments later, carrying a worn leather bag filled with supplies. He took one look at Luna and exhaled deeply. "She's severely malnourished. The cubs too. They won't last much longer without proper care." Elena's hands tightened into fists. "Then we help them." Sophie and Daniel exchanged a glance before nodding. Together, they moved carefully, working in quiet harmony. Daniel examined the cubs from a safe distance, noting their weakness, their thin limbs. Sophie prepared more food, blending softened oats with honey to make it easier for them to eat. Luna watched it all, her dark eyes unreadable. She did not growl, did not move to attack. Perhaps she was too tired. Or perhaps, somehow, she understood. Hours passed in slow, careful efforts. The cubs ate more. Luna remained alert but did not resist. As the sun climbed higher, Elena felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't dared to feel since she first saw them. Hope. This was only the beginning. They had a long road ahead, one that might lead back to the wild, to safety, to survival. But in this moment, one thing was certain: they were not alone anymore. The morning air was still crisp when Sophie Adams and Dr. Daniel Lee arrived. This time with a team of wildlife rescuers. Their vehicles pulled into Elena Carter's driveway, their presence both urgent and careful. The scene before them was sobering. Luna, still thin and weak, lay curled around her two cubs, Theo and Milo, beneath the towering oak, though slightly more alert than the previous day. Her body bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged starvation. Dr. Lee moved forward first, his years of experience guiding his every step. He observed the slow, shallow breathing of the mother bear, the delicate, hesitant movements of the cubs. Their fur, though thick, could not completely conceal the sharp ridges of their rib cages. Sophie knelt beside him, taking notes, her sharp eyes scanning for any signs of immediate medical distress. "She's hanging on," Dr. Lee murmured, glancing toward Elena, who stood nearby, wringing her hands. "But just barely." Sophie nodded. "The cubs are in rough shape. But they're eating. That's a good sign." Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had spent the past 24 hours in a state of constant worry, watching the bears from her kitchen window, preparing small portions of food, ensuring they had space and quiet. But this was bigger than her now. It was bigger than just one act of kindness. And it was about to become even bigger. Word of the bear family's plight had already begun to spread. A neighbor had taken a photo the night before, a haunting image of Luna, thin and weary, curled protectively around her cubs. They had posted it online with a simple message: "A mother bear, desperate and starving, has come to our town for help. What can we do?" Within hours, the post had been shared hundreds, then thousands of times. People from across the town, and soon beyond, saw the image and felt an undeniable pull in their hearts. These were not just animals lost in the wilderness. They were a mother and her children, fighting to survive. By the time Sophie and Dr. Lee arrived, the community had already begun to mobilize. Neighbors began showing up at Elena's door, arms filled with carefully selected food, fresh berries, nuts, fish, and even jars of natural honey. All items researched to provide sustenance without creating dependency on humans. They understood that Luna and her cubs needed help, but they also needed to remain wild. "I saw the post this morning," said Mr. Henderson, a retired teacher who lived 2 streets over. "Brought some salmon I had in the freezer. I read they eat fish. Figured it might help." Elena smiled through teary eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness surrounding her. "It will, thank you." More and more people arrived. Some brought food, others blankets to lay near the tree for warmth. Children came, wide-eyed and hopeful, whispering to their parents about how they had never seen a real bear before. The wildlife rescue team worked swiftly to assess the situation. One rescuer, Maria Lopez, spoke quietly with Sophie. "We've contacted a wildlife rehabilitation center. They specialize in cases like this, bears who are starving but still have a chance to return to the wild." Sophie nodded, relief washing over her. "How soon can they come?" "Tomorrow at the earliest," Maria replied. "In the meantime, we continue feeding them, monitoring their condition, and ensuring they aren't in danger." Elena glanced toward Luna, who had shifted slightly, her eyes scanning the humans around her. There was no fear in her gaze, only exhaustion, and something deeper. Something that made Elena's heart ache. Trust. Luna was allowing them to help her. But more than that, she understood that this was not an attack, not a threat. It was hope. As the day stretched on, an extraordinary thing happened. People who had never met before, neighbors who had only exchanged polite nods at the grocery store, came together with a shared purpose. They organized shifts to watch over the bears from a safe distance, ensuring they weren't disturbed. They collected donations for the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, sending messages to local businesses to gather additional resources. Then, a journalist from the local newspaper arrived. She had seen the viral post and wanted to tell the full story. With Elena's permission, she took photographs of the community's efforts, capturing the way people worked together, the way Luna watched over her cubs, the way the town had turned a moment of desperation into a movement of compassion. Within hours, national news outlets picked up the story. Wildlife organizations reached out, offering support, providing expert guidance on the best way to handle the situation. Messages poured in from people across the country, some simply expressing their admiration, others asking how they could help. But amidst all the attention, all the activity, there was one moment that stood out above the rest. As the sun began to set, casting golden light over the yard, Elena brought out one last small meal for the bears, softened oats mixed with honey, along with bits of fresh fruit. She placed it down carefully and stepped back. Luna, though still weak, moved forward, but she didn't eat. Instead, she nudged the food toward Theo and Milo. Elena watched, her breath catching in her throat. The mother bear, who had been starving for weeks, who had fought against exhaustion, against hunger, against the very limits of her body, was giving her food to her children. Even in the depths of her suffering, she prioritized them. A hush fell over the small crowd gathered in Elena's yard. A mother's love, stronger than hunger, stronger than pain. Tears welled in Elena's eyes. And she was not alone. Around her, people wiped at their faces, overwhelmed by the simple, heartbreaking beauty of the moment. Sophie squeezed Elena's hand. "She's incredible," she whispered. Elena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The next day, The wildlife rehabilitation team arrived. They worked carefully, assessing Luna and the cubs, ensuring they were stable enough to transport. The plan was to move them to a protected sanctuary, where they would be fed, monitored, and slowly prepared for a return to the wild. It was the best outcome anyone could have hoped for. As the team prepared for the transfer, Elena approached Luna one last time. She kept a respectful distance but met the mother bear's eyes. "You're going to be okay," she murmured. "You and your babies." Luna blinked slowly, then turned her attention back to Theo and Milo. As the truck pulled away, carrying the bear family towards safety, Elena felt something shift within her. This had started as a moment of desperation, a mother bear stepping into the unknown in search of salvation. But it had become so much more. It was a story of kindness, of resilience, of a town that had come together to save a family that wasn't their own, but had become part of them all the same. And though Luna and her cubs were leaving, they had left something behind. A reminder that compassion, true, unshaken, selfless compassion, had the power to change everything. The morning air was fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. A crisp reminder that the seasons were changing. Spring had finally settled in, and with it came new life, buds on the trees, the soft hum of insects returning, the distant calls of birds rebuilding their nests. But the most extraordinary renewal of all was happening within the sanctuary where Luna and her cubs had spent the last few weeks. Theo and Milo, once weak and struggling, were now thriving. Their small, frail bodies had filled out with new strength, their fur sleek and shining under the sunlight. They tumbled over one another, wrestling in the grass, swiping playfully with their tiny paws. Their once wary movements had been replaced with the boundless energy of youth, their instincts sharpening with each passing day. And Luna, she had transformed. The gaunt, desperate mother bear who had arrived on Elena Carter's doorstep, clinging to life, was no more. In her place stood a magnificent creature, powerful and restored, her golden brown fur gleaming, her muscles once again taut and strong. She moved with the grace and confidence of a queen reclaiming her throne. Her deep, intelligent eyes no longer clouded by hunger or exhaustion. Her recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. For weeks, under the care of the wildlife rehabilitation team, Luna had regained her strength. Nourished by proper food and given the space to heal, her cubs had followed suit, learning to forage, to climb, to navigate their world as young bears should. Every day had been a step closer to this moment, the moment when they would be ready to return to the wild. And that moment had arrived. The decision had been made. It was time. The town had been following their journey from the beginning. What had started as a desperate plea for survival had become something far greater. A story of resilience, of kindness, of an entire community coming together to save a family that had once been on the brink of death. Now, on the morning of their release, the entire town gathered. Children clutched their parents' hands, their faces alight with both excitement and sadness. Elderly neighbors, who had seen many things in their long lives, wiped their eyes with quiet smiles. The volunteers who had spent days and nights ensuring the bears' well-being stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions a mix of pride and farewell. Elena stood at the front, her heart heavy yet full. She had watched Luna's journey from the very first moment the bear had appeared in her yard, had felt the weight of her suffering, had done everything she could to help her survive. And now, she would watch her go. The wildlife experts opened the transport gate. For a brief moment, Luna hesitated, standing at the threshold. She lifted her nose to the air, sniffing the wind as if tasting the freedom that lay beyond. The forest stretched before her, vast and untouched, whispering a silent welcome. Theo and Milo, ever eager, took the first steps, bounding forward into the open space. their youthful energy carrying him through the grass. They paused, looking back at their mother, waiting for her. Luna turned, and for a fleeting second, her gaze met Elena's. The world seemed to pause. It was not a look of fear, nor of confusion. It was something deeper, something unspoken yet profoundly understood. A silent gratitude, a final acknowledgement of the bond that had been formed, however briefly, between a wild mother and the woman who had helped her when she had nowhere else to turn. Elena felt her throat tighten, tears welling in her eyes. She raised a hand, though she knew Luna did not understand the gesture. "Go on, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're home now." And with that, Luna turned and strode forward. Her movements fluid, powerful. She caught up with her cubs, nudging him onward, guiding him as she always had. Together, the three of them disappeared into the trees. A hush fell over the crowd, followed by the quiet sound of sniffles, the wiping of eyes. It was a beautiful moment, but also bittersweet. They had saved them, but now they had to let them go. Elena lingered after the others had left. The oak tree, the place where Luna had first rested with her cubs, stood tall and strong, its roots deep in the earth. It had witnessed the entire journey, from despair to hope, from near death to new life. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small wooden plaque she had made in the past few days. Kneeling down, she pressed it into the soil beneath the tree, ensuring it would stay. The engraving read, "Here, under this tree, a mother bear sought refuge with her children. Through the kindness of strangers, she found hope, and through her strength, she returned to the wild. May this place forever remind us that compassion has no boundaries, and that even the wildest hearts deserve love." Elena ran her fingers over the words, then stepped back, taking one last look at the forest where Luna had vanished. A breeze stirred the leaves, rustling through the branches, carrying with it the distant sound of movement, perhaps the sound of a mother bear, guiding her cubs deeper into the safety of the wilderness. And for the first time in a long time, Elena smiled through her tears. Somewhere out there, Luna was free again, and that was exactly how it should be.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.